My name is Celestine Okafor, and I am 52 years old. I was a chef for 19 years. Not a celebrity chef, not a television chef, a real one. The kind who arrives at 6 a.m. and leaves at midnight and spends the hours in between managing a line of people who are simultaneously performing and barely holding together, and who does this 6 days a week because the seventh day is the only day the produce orders don't come in and you need one morning to do the paperwork. I co-owned a restaurant for 11 years. I say co-owned. What I mean is that I ran the restaurant, the kitchen, the staff, the vendors, the menu, the health inspections, the inventory, the training, the firing, the hiring, and the 4 a.m. calls when the walk-in cooler decided to die during the hottest week of August. What my business partner Marcus Reeves co-owned was the original investment, the dining room, the wine list, and the relationships with the kind of people who could get a table on a Saturday night by calling ahead. We had a partnership agreement. I want to say that clearly, because I know what you are thinking and you are wrong. We had a partnership agreement, drafted by an actual attorney, signed by both of us, notarized. 50-50. Equal shares in the profits, equal shares in the decision-making, equal responsibility for the debts. The agreement was real. The partnership it described was not. What the partnership actually was, for 11 years, was Marcus's name on the reservation cards and Celestine's hands on every surface of the building, and a growing discrepancy between those two things that I documented in a notebook I kept in my locker in the kitchen, beside my knife roll, from month 4 of year 1 until the day I walked out. That notebook, and what I did with it, is why I am sitting here today instead of starting over with nothing. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories. My name is Celestine, and this is the channel where ordinary women discover that the agreement on paper is only as good as the people enforcing it, and that when those people stop enforcing it, you need to be prepared to enforce it yourself. If you are new here, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. Stay with me, because this story starts in a kitchen and ends in a negotiation, and the distance between those two places is 11 years and a notebook that my business partner did not know existed. Let me tell you about Marcus. Marcus Reeves was 43 when we opened the restaurant. He had money, inheritance money, carefully managed, the kind that does not make you rich exactly but makes you comfortable enough to take risks. He had taste, which is different from money and sometimes more useful. He had contacts, people who went to restaurants because restaurants were where people like them went, and who told other people like them about places worth going, and who could fill a dining room on a reputation alone. What he did not have was operational knowledge. He had never worked a line. He had never negotiated with a produce supplier. He had never written a menu that balanced food cost against margin against what people actually wanted to eat on a Tuesday in February, when the thing they had ordered on a Saturday in July seemed wrong. I had done all of those things for 15 years before we opened. We met through a mutual acquaintance, at a dinner where I had been brought in to cook. Marcus came into the kitchen afterward, which guests sometimes do and which I normally find intrusive, but which on this occasion I permitted because he asked correctly. He said, "Can I come in, or are you still working?" I said, "I'm always still working. But come in." He asked good questions. Not the questions guests usually ask, which are about the food. He asked about the kitchen, the flow of it, how I organized the line, what I would change if the space were mine to design. He was curious about systems, which is unusual in a person who does not run them. We talked for 2 hours. He called me the following week and said he wanted to invest in a restaurant and he thought I was the person to run it. I was 39 and I had spent 15 years building other people's kitchens. I said yes. Looking back, I can see the shape of what we each brought to the table and what each of us did not bring. Marcus brought capital and contacts and the dining room sensibility that I did not have and did not want. I brought the kitchen, the operations, the staff, the food. We were, in theory, complementary. 50-50. In practice, what 50-50 means is that both parties are equal in authority and responsibility. What it became, in practice, was that I was equal in responsibility and unequal in authority, and that the distance between those two things grew a little wider every year. Not because Marcus was cruel. Because he was comfortable. Comfortable people do not notice, incrementally, when the weight is shifting, because the weight is not shifting onto them. I started the notebook in month 4 because I noticed, in month 4, that things were beginning to shift. The notebook was a standard composition book, black cover, college ruled. I bought a new one every year. By the end of 11 years, I had 11 composition books in the bottom of a box in my storage unit, filled with a daily record of what I had done and what Marcus had done and what the restaurant had cost us and what it had made us and what decisions had been made by whom and what the consequences had been. I want to be precise about what was in them, because the contents are what mattered. Every day, I recorded the date, the shift, what was served, any significant issues with staff or vendors or equipment. I recorded every meeting Marcus and I had about the business, not always verbatim, but with enough substance to reconstruct the conversation. I recorded every financial decision, every variance from budget, every change to the menu and whose idea it was and why. I recorded every time Marcus made a unilateral decision, something the partnership agreement required us to decide together, and what that decision was and what it cost. I was not, in the beginning, building a case. I am a chef. Chefs keep records. You cannot run a kitchen without records: the food cost tracking, the inventory, the prep lists, the staff schedules. The notebook was an extension of the professional habit, applied to the business relationship the way I applied it to the food. By year 3, I had started to understand that the records were going to be important in a way I had not originally anticipated. Year 3 is when Marcus began, gradually and without any single obvious moment, to treat the restaurant as more his than mine. It started with how he talked about it. Not to me, to the dining room guests, the wine people, the journalists who occasionally wrote about the city's restaurant scene. He talked about the restaurant as something he had built, which was not inaccurate exactly. He had built the dining room, the atmosphere, the front-of-house culture that made people want to come back. But the way he talked about it left the kitchen out of the accounting, and leaving the kitchen out of the accounting of a restaurant is like leaving the engine out of the accounting of a car. I noticed this, and I wrote it down. Not with anger. I write the way I cook, with the temperature at steady medium, not too hot. Just the facts. Date, context, what was said and by whom and to whom and what it implied. Year 4, Marcus hired a general manager for the front of house without consulting me. The partnership agreement required joint approval for all management hires. I read the agreement again when he told me after the fact. I noted the clause. I noted the date and what Marcus had said, which was, I needed to move quickly, the candidate had another offer. I noted that this was the first time but probably would not be the last. It was not the last. Year 5, Marcus began to modify the wine list unilaterally. This was more his domain than mine, I did not pretend otherwise, but the wine program affected the food, which was my domain, and changes to one without consultation of the other created friction on the plate. I raised it once, directly. He said, "It's the wine list, Celestine. That's my side." I said, "Our side. The agreement says joint decisions on all business operations." He said, "Wine is a dining room decision." I wrote down that conversation. Date, time, substance. His exact words. Wine is a dining room decision. My response. The outcome, which was that nothing changed. Year 6, the disagreement shifted from operational to financial. The restaurant had been profitable since year 2. Not extravagantly. Restaurants are not extravagant businesses, the margins are specific and unforgiving, but genuinely profitable, consistently, in a way that reflected the quality of the food and the reliability of the operations I had built. We were paying back Marcus's original investment on schedule. We were drawing equal salaries, as the agreement specified. In year 6, Marcus proposed that his salary be increased. Not both salaries, his. He argued that the front-of-house work he was doing, the client relationships, the events he organized, the reputation management, was generating revenue that was not reflected in the current compensation structure. I said, "The agreement specifies equal compensation." He said, the agreement can be amended. I said, by mutual agreement, which requires both of us. He said, I'm asking for your agreement. I said, no. He looked at me. It was the first clean no I had given him in 6 years, and the room shifted the way rooms shift when the shape of a relationship becomes visible. He did not amend the agreement. But something changed in how he talked about the restaurant after that. The language got more possessive. The decisions got more unilateral. And he started, in small ways that individually seemed like nothing and collectively were significant, to undermine my authority with the staff. He would override my kitchen decisions with the front-of-house manager, the one he had hired without my approval in year 4, about how dishes would be described on the menu, without telling me. He would comp meals for his contacts using the kitchen's food cost without logging the comps, which affected our margins and which I tracked because I tracked everything. He would make commitments to private events that required kitchen capacity I had not been consulted about, and then tell me about them 2 weeks out. Each instance, individually, was something I could address. Collectively, they were a pattern. The pattern had a direction, and the direction was toward a restaurant that Marcus ran and I worked in, rather than a restaurant we ran together. I wrote all of it down. Date by date, instance by instance, cross-referenced against the partnership agreement clauses I had flagged with sticky tabs. I was not building a case. I was keeping the record. By year 8, I knew I was building a case. The break happened in year 9, and it happened the way breaks happen, not all at once, but through a single moment that showed you the shape of everything that had been building. Marcus told me, at the end of service on a Thursday, that he had been in conversations with a hospitality group about a potential second location. He had been in these conversations for 4 months. He had not told me. I said, 4 months. He said, I didn't want to get your hopes up before it was real. I said, you were in negotiations about opening a second location under our partnership and you didn't tell me for 4 months. He said, conversations, not negotiations. I said, what's the difference? He said, I wasn't committing us to anything. I said, you were committing information about our partnership to a third party without my knowledge or consent. The agreement requires joint disclosure of any material business discussions. He looked at me the way he had looked at me in year 6 when I said no about the salary. But this time the look had something additional in it, not just surprise, not just the recognition that I had held my ground. Something that told me he had expected by year 9 to have more room than he did. That the slow accumulation of unilateral decisions had not produced the outcome he had perhaps anticipated, which was a partner who had stopped reading the agreement. I had not stopped reading the agreement. He said, Celestine, this is a good opportunity. I said, I agree it might be. I disagree with how you've handled the approach to it, and I need to know everything about those conversations before we go any further. He told me. Not everything. I would find out later that he had not told me everything, but enough for me to understand that the hospitality group had been assessing our restaurant as a potential franchise model, and that in those 4 months of conversations, Marcus had represented himself as the primary operational decision-maker. As the primary operational decision-maker. I went home that night and opened the notebook and wrote for an hour. Everything he had said, as close to verbatim as I could reconstruct. The date of the conversation, the timeline he had given me, what the hospitality group had been told about who ran what. Then I opened the partnership agreement, which I kept in a folder in my home office beside the notebooks, and I read it again from the beginning. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Dana Achebe. She was a business litigation attorney, referred to me by the accountant who had done our books for 8 years and who I had called the following morning before I called anyone else. The accountant's name was Phil. Phil had done our books since year 1 and had the specific quality of accountants who have seen everything and been surprised by nothing in 20 years. When I told him what Marcus had told me the previous night, Phil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Celestine, I need to ask you something. I said, go ahead. He said, the management fee Marcus has been charging the restaurant for the last 3 years. Did you sign off on that? I said, What management fee? Phil was quiet again. He said, I'm going to send you something. Look at it and call me back. He sent me 3 years of line items in the restaurant's books that I had not seen. Not because I had been excluded from the books exactly. I had seen the summaries, the P&L statements, the tax returns Phil prepared. But there was a category labeled management services that had been growing every year, paid to an LLC that I did not recognize, that I had not questioned because the category had always been there and I had assumed it referred to the front-of-house management software we used. It did not refer to the software. Phil had dug into it after I called. The LLC was Marcus's. He had been billing the restaurant for his own time as manager, effectively paying himself a second compensation stream out of the partnership's operating funds for 3 years. The total was $214,000. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at Phil's email for a long time. I am a chef. I have worked in professional kitchens for 34 years. I have had my share of bad employers, difficult partners, vendors who did not deliver, and staff who did not show up. I have had the very specific experience of being underestimated by people who did not understand what running a kitchen actually required, and I have handled all of it with a steady medium temperature that I use for everything, not too hot, not reactive, just present and paying attention. I read Phil's email and I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief and was mostly, beneath both of those, a specific and complete clarity. I knew what had happened. I knew what it was. I knew what I was going to do about it. I called Dana. Dana Achebe was 51, precise, and had handled enough business partnership disputes to have developed a specific economy of language about them. She did not editorialize. She asked questions and she listened to the answers and she filed what she learned into an assessment that was, when she delivered it, as clear as anything I had ever heard. She said, "You have a partnership agreement being violated in 3 specific ways. Unilateral hiring decisions, undisclosed business negotiations, and unauthorized compensation through the LLC. You have 8 years of documentation, and you have an accountant who can provide forensic detail on the financial fraud." Financial fraud. The words settled into the room. I said, "Is it fraud? Or is it mismanagement?" She said, "That depends on whether the management fee was deliberately concealed from you. If he set up the LLC knowing you had not agreed to it and would not agree to it, and structured the payments to avoid your notice, that is fraud. If he genuinely believed he had authority to establish his own compensation, which would be a remarkable thing to believe given the partnership agreement, it is mismanagement. Either way, it is recoverable." I said, "What does recoverable mean?" She said, "The $214,000 he paid himself is a breach of fiduciary duty. As your partner, he owed you a duty of loyalty and full disclosure. The management fee was neither. We can pursue that amount, and potentially more, including a percentage of the second location discussions that he conducted as though the restaurant were his alone." I said, "What do I want to do?" She said, "That is what I am asking you. I want to tell you about the night I decided what I wanted to do, because it was not the night I talked to Dana. It was 2 days later, after I had sat with all of it, the 11 notebooks, the partnership agreement with its flagged clauses, Phil's analysis of the management fee, Dana's assessment, and let the full shape of it settle. I cooked that night. This is what I do when I need to think. I cook, the way other people run or clean or sit with music. I made a dish I had been working on for the menu for the coming season, a thing with winter squash and brown butter and a sauce I had been testing for 3 weeks that was not yet right. It became right that night. The ratio was the problem. I had been overweighting one element at the expense of the balance, and when I corrected the ratio, the dish resolved into what it had been trying to be the whole time. I stood at my kitchen counter at 11 p.m. eating the finished version of the dish and thinking about what I wanted. I did not want to destroy Marcus. I want to say that clearly. He was not a villain, exactly. He was a man who had grown comfortable, who had let his sense of ownership expand beyond what the agreement allowed, who had made decisions that he had rationalized as his to make. That does not make them right. It makes him human in a specific and costly way. What I wanted was what the agreement said I was owed. 50% of a partnership that had been operating for 3 years at minimum, as though I owned less than that. I wanted the $214,000 acknowledged and returned. I wanted the second location discussions brought to the table properly, with both of us at it. And I wanted, if we could not work together honestly after all of that, a fair exit. A fair exit. Not nothing. Not whatever Marcus decided was reasonable when the time came. A negotiated, documented, legally binding exit that reflected 11 years of my work in the building. I called Dana the next morning and told her. She said, "Good. That is a clear set of objectives." I said, "Can we get them?" She said, "We have the documentation. The question is whether we get there through negotiation or litigation." I said, "I would prefer negotiation." She said, "So would most people. So likely would Marcus when he understands what the documentation shows." The meeting was at Dana's office. Marcus came with his attorney, a man named Richard who had the smooth, contained energy of someone who has been in many rooms like this and knows that the outcome is determined before anyone speaks. He looked at Dana. Dana looked at him. Some professional assessment passed between them that I was not privy to, but that told me both of them already understood the contours of the situation. Dana opened by distributing Phil's analysis of the management fee. 3 years, $214,000. An LLC that Marcus had registered in Ohio 18 months before the payments began, without disclosing the registration to me. Marcus looked at the document. He did not look at me. Dana said, "I'd like to understand your client's position on this." Richard said, "The management fee reflected the additional operational burden Mr. Reeves took on as the restaurant scaled. He believed he was entitled to additional compensation for that work." Dana said, "Under what provision of the partnership agreement?" Richard was quiet for a moment. Then, "The agreement provides for compensation review." Dana said, "Compensation review by mutual agreement. I have documentation that no such review was held or proposed. I have additionally, and I'd like to draw your attention to this, a record of every significant business decision made at this restaurant over 11 years, including every instance in which Mr. Reeves acted unilaterally in matters the agreement designates as joint. The documentation spans 8 years and is contemporaneous." Marcus looked up. He looked at me for the first time since the meeting had started. I met his eyes, not with hostility, with the same steady attention I have given every situation in my professional life, the attention that does not perform and does not flinch. He looked away. Richard said, "What does your client want?" Dana said, "She wants the management fee returned in full. She wants full disclosure and joint participation in the second location discussions, retroactive. She wants a formal amendment to the partnership agreement clarifying decision-making authority going forward, with penalties for unilateral action. And she wants a buyout option at fair market value established and documented, in the event that the partnership cannot be restored to the terms of the original agreement." A long silence. Marcus said, not to Richard, to me, directly, "I didn't think you were tracking all of this." I said, "I know." He said, "The notebooks." I said, "Yes." He said, "How long?" I said, "Month 4 of year 1. He sat with that. Then he said, quietly and without his attorney and in the specific tone of a person who has just understood something they should have understood a long time ago, "I underestimated you." I said, "Yes, you did." The negotiation took 6 weeks. I will give you the outcome without the procedural detail, because the detail is technical and the outcome is the thing that matters. Marcus returned the $214,000, structured as a restoration to the partnership's operating account rather than a personal payment to me, which was the correct legal treatment and which Phil managed. The partnership agreement was formally amended with specific enforcement language around the unilateral decision clauses, including financial penalties for violations. I was given full disclosure of the second location discussions and a 60-day right of first participation, meaning I had 60 days to evaluate the opportunity and decide whether I wanted to pursue it jointly. I did not pursue it. I took the buyout instead. The buyout was valued at the restaurant's fair market valuation, which Dana had commissioned from an independent assessor. My 50% of a restaurant that had been operating profitably for 9 years was significant. Not life-changing in the abstract sense, significant in the specific sense of a woman who has worked her hands and her back and her brain for 34 years and deserves the number that reflects it. I signed the buyout agreement on a Thursday afternoon. I shook Dana's hand. I did not shake Marcus's hand, not from animosity, because the gesture would not have been honest and I do not perform honesty. I drove home. I made dinner. I sat at the table with the notebook, the 11th one, the current one, and I wrote the last entry. Date. Buyout signed. Partnership dissolved. The number. What it represents. Then I closed the notebook and put it in the box with the other 10. Here is what I want to say about 11 years of documenting a business partnership. It was not revenge. It was not even preparation for this specific outcome. I had not, in year one, anticipated that I would be sitting across from Marcus's attorney 11 years later with Phil's forensic analysis on the table and a buyout offer being discussed. I had started the notebook because it was what I knew how to do. Because I had run professional kitchens my entire adult life and professional kitchens run on records. What I want you to understand is this: the records did not protect me from what happened. Marcus still took $214,000 that was not his to take. The partnership still operated for years with an imbalance that the agreement did not sanction. I still spent 11 years doing work that was credited to the dining room instead of the kitchen. What the records did was make the truth retrievable. That is what records do. They do not prevent the truth from being obscured. They make it possible to unobscure it when the moment comes. The moment always comes. It comes in a conference room or an attorney's office, or a meeting where someone puts a document on the table that cannot be disputed, or a moment when the person who underestimated you says, quietly, "I didn't think you were tracking all of this." You are always tracking it. The records are the proof. I am 52 years old. I have a buyout and 11 notebooks and the dish with the winter squash that is now on the menu of the restaurant I am opening alone, in a building I have signed the lease on myself, with a partnership agreement that I have drafted with Dana and that I will be the only party to. Because the only partner I have decided to trust completely is the one I see in the mirror, and she keeps excellent records, and she does not underestimate herself anymore. The restaurant opens in April. I have been working on the menu since October. Every dish has a version history, every iteration, what I changed and why, what it was working toward. Not because I expect to need the history. Because the history is the record of the thinking, and the thinking is what the dish is made of, and the dish is what I am. You make the record first. Then you make the dish. If you are in a business partnership right now, or a collaboration, or a joint venture, or any arrangement where two people are supposed to have equal power and you suspect the power is not equal, I want to ask you one question before I let you go. When did you last read the agreement? Not the gist of it. The actual document. The clauses that specify what requires joint approval. The compensation provisions. The exit terms. The dispute resolution process. Read it this week. Read it with the last 6 months of the partnership in mind and notice where the practice does not match the paper. Notice the gap. The gap is where the notebook needs to start. You do not have to do anything about the gap immediately. You do not have to confront anyone or file anything or make any decisions. You just have to see it. You just have to write it down. Date the entry. Start the file. The records do not create the problem. They find it. And finding it clearly on paper with dates is the difference between a feeling and a fact, and only one of those gets you to the number you deserve. Keep the notebook. Date every entry. Do not throw it away. And if someone tells you they did not think you were tracking all of this, smile. Say, "I know." Then let the notebook speak. That is my story. 11 years, 11 notebooks, one accountant named Phil, one attorney named Dana, one moment in a conference room when a man said I underestimated you, and a buyout that reflected 34 years of professional life correctly for the first time. If this found you at the right moment, if you are in a room where the weight is shifting and you have been telling yourself it is just a feeling, start the notebook tonight. Just tonight's entry. Just what happened today and what it means and what you want the record to say. You will know what to write. You have always known. You just needed someone to tell you to start. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. And if someone you love is in a partnership where something is not adding up, share this with them. It might be the most useful thing you do for them this week. Subscribe if you are new here. I will see you in the next one. The restaurant opens in April. If you are in Cincinnati, come find me. Let me take you inside the kitchen, because you need to understand what I was doing there before you can understand what I lost and what I protected. A professional kitchen runs on systems. Every great kitchen I have ever worked in, and I have worked in kitchens in 4 cities, on 3 different types of line, from 6-seat tasting menus to high-volume brasseries, had systems that were so embedded in the culture of the place that new cooks absorbed them the way you absorb a language when you live somewhere long enough. The systems were not glamorous. They were prep lists and temperature logs and cleaning schedules and expediting protocols and the specific choreography of a dinner service where 12 people in a small space are moving fast and hot and everything has to work in the right order or everything fails simultaneously. I built those systems at Reeves and Okafor. That is what we called it. His name first, which was a decision made at opening that I had not examined closely enough at the time and which I understood differently by year 4. I built the prep system and the inventory system and the purchasing relationships and the staff scheduling software I had adapted from a template into something specific to our needs. I trained every cook who came through that kitchen. I developed the menu, twice a year, for 11 years. I wrote the training manual, the first one and every revised edition. None of this was visible to the dining room. That is the nature of a kitchen. It is the part of the restaurant that the guest never sees, which means it is the part that the person in the dining room can most easily talk around. Marcus talked around it with fluency. He had the vocabulary of someone who had eaten in many excellent restaurants and understood how to describe food, how to speak about the philosophy of a menu, how to position a restaurant to the people who write about restaurants. He could hold a conversation about my food that sounded knowledgeable, and it was knowledgeable, but it was knowledge about the outcome, not the process, and the distance between those two things is the distance between the diner and the cook. I was the cook. For 11 years. What this meant in the partnership was that Marcus's contribution was legible. People could see it, experience it, describe it, attribute it to him. The dining room was his. The wine was his. The relationships were his. These are real contributions, and I do not minimize them. My contribution was invisible in exactly the way that all operational infrastructure is invisible. It disappeared into the function of the thing. When the walk-in was properly maintained, nobody noticed. When the staff turnover was low because I had built a training culture that made people want to stay, nobody attributed the retention to anything in particular. When the food cost was consistently under target because I had negotiated the right vendor terms and managed the prep waste correctly, the profit showed up on the P&L and Marcus said, "Good year. Good year." As though the year had been good on its own. I wrote that down too. Date, context, what he said, what it meant. The notebook absorbed everything. I want to tell you about the staff, because they are the part of this story that I care about most. In 11 years, I trained approximately 60 people in that kitchen. Some of them stayed for a season, the transient population of young cooks who are still figuring out what kind of cook they want to be. Some of them stayed for years. 3 of them are now running their own kitchens in other cities, in one case another country. I know where all of them are. Not because I track them, because they tell me. They send messages. They send photographs of dishes. One of them sent me a picture of his first menu, weeks after he opened, with a note that said, "I used your chicken stock method. It still works. Of course it still works. It is a good method." The staff were my clearest evidence in every year that what I was building was real. Not the P&L. The P&L is a number, clean and cold, indifferent to who produced it. The staff were the human record. They were what the kitchen actually was, beyond the line items. Marcus did not know most of their names. Not from cruelty, from habit. They were in the back. He was in the front. The front and the back are different worlds in a restaurant, and in ours, they became increasingly separate as the years went on. In year 7, a cook named Darius left. He had been with us for 3 years, which is a long time for a line cook, and he was good, the kind of good that requires almost no correction, just refinement. He left because he had been offered a sous chef position elsewhere. He came to tell me in person, which is the way people leave when they have been treated well. He said, "I want to thank you for how you run the kitchen. I've worked in other places. It's not always like this." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You explain things. You don't just tell people what to do. You tell them why." I thought about that for a long time after he left. Not because it was a compliment, though it was. Because it was the clearest description anyone had ever given me of what I was doing in that kitchen. I was building understanding, not just compliance. I was creating a kitchen that could function because the people in it knew what they were doing and why, not just because I was telling them when. That kind of kitchen can survive without you for a shift. It can absorb a new person faster. It can solve problems you have not anticipated because the problem-solving framework has been installed. I had built that in 11 years. In the negotiation, Dana pointed to the low staff turnover rate compared to industry average as evidence of the quality of my operational management. Phil had the numbers. Dana presented them. Darius's departure was in my notebook. Date that he left, what he said, why. 60 people over 11 years, tracked. Not because I was building a case, because the people who passed through my kitchen were the living record of what I was making, and living records deserve documentation just as much as financial ones. I want to tell you about the moment in year 8 when I almost said something to Marcus directly. Not about the management fee. I did not know about the management fee until Phil's call 9 months before the conference room. I mean about the broader pattern. The unilateral decisions, the way he talked about the restaurant, the visible/invisible divide that had been growing since year 3. I almost said it at the end of a Thursday service in February, the slow month when the restaurant finds its honesty after the holiday rush. We had had a good service, the kind where everything runs the way you designed it to run, and we were closing down together, which we rarely did by year 8. He tended to leave before the kitchen closed. He said, "Good night." I said, "Marcus, I want to talk about something." He said, "Now?" I said, "When would be a good time?" He looked at me. He said, "What's on your mind?" I said, "I think the way we're describing the restaurant to people, the way you describe it, leaves the kitchen out of the story. And I think that affects how the partnership is understood by the people we work with and the people we want to work with." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I talk about the food constantly. I talk about your food to everyone." I said, "You talk about the food. You don't talk about the kitchen. They're different things." He said, "I'm not sure I understand the distinction." I said, "The food is the product. The kitchen is the infrastructure that makes the product possible, every day, consistently, at scale. When people understand the kitchen, they understand what the restaurant actually is. When they only understand the food, they understand what the restaurant makes." He looked at me. He said, "I hear you." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means I hear you. I'll think about it." He thought about it and nothing changed, and I added the conversation to the notebook because it was the clearest statement I had made to that point of what the problem was, and I wanted it on record that I had said it. I did not say it again. Not because I gave up, but because I understood, in the weeks after that Thursday, that the conversation I had tried to have was one Marcus was not capable of having in a useful way. Not from bad intention, because the distinction I was drawing required him to see something about his own blind spots, and the people who most need to see their blind spots are usually the least able to see them without a document that makes looking away impossible. The document came later. Phil's email provided it. The restaurant I am opening in April is called Celestine's. Not because I am vain about my name, I am not, particularly. Because for 11 years my name was the second name on a building I ran, and the second name in a partnership I worked, and I have decided that the work and the name deserve to be in the same place this time. Celestine's. My name. My kitchen. My system. My menu, which I have been writing and rewriting since October with the focus of someone who has been making other people's menus for 19 years and is finally making one entirely for herself. The lease is in my name. The permits are in my name. The vendor relationships I have been rebuilding since the buyout are in my name. Dana reviewed the vendor contracts. Phil is doing the books because Phil is the best accountant I have ever worked with and because people who show up honestly during a difficult time are worth keeping. I have not hired a partner. I have hired staff. A sous chef named Amara who I trained for 2 years at the old restaurant and who reached out when she heard I was starting something new. A front-of-house manager named Claude who comes from the hotel industry and has the specific operational intelligence of someone who has managed large volumes of guests and understands that service is a system, not a performance. A wine consultant I am working with on retainer rather than partnership because I have learned what partnerships cost when they are not structured correctly. I have a notebook. New cover, first entry dated October 12th, the day I signed the lease. I am keeping it the same way I have always kept notebooks, the daily record, the decisions and the reasoning, the staff and the vendors and the numbers. The same habit, now entirely mine. The first entry says, October 12th, lease signed. Celestine's. My name on the door on the first day. Everything after that is what I am building. I want to say one more thing about Marcus, because I think it is the most important thing and I have been saving it. The moment in the conference room when he said I underestimated you, that moment was not about the notebook, exactly. It was about what the notebook represented. It represented 11 years of paying attention, of taking the operation seriously enough to document it, of treating the work as something worth keeping a record of, even when the room was not keeping a record, even when the accounting was not crediting it, even when his name came first on the door. He had underestimated me because I had let him, not consciously. I had not chosen to be underestimated, had not made a decision on any given day to allow the diminishment of my contribution. But I had stayed. I had kept working. I had built the kitchen and the staff and the systems and the 11 notebooks, and I had not, until year 9, forced the conversation that the notebooks were preparing me to have. He underestimated me because I was in the kitchen and he was in the dining room, and the kitchen is invisible and I had not made it visible. I am making it visible now. Celestine's is visible. The name is on the door. The story is on this channel. The notebooks are in the box and the new one is on my desk, and when April comes and the restaurant opens, the first dish I make will be the winter squash dish that resolved at my kitchen counter at 11 p.m. in the week after Phil's email, when I understood what I wanted and what I was going to do about it. It is a good dish. It took 3 weeks to get the ratio right. Most good things do. I want to tell you what the week after the conference room felt like, because it was one of the stranger weeks of my life. I had prepared for years, not consciously, not with this endpoint in mind, but prepared in the sense that the documentation existed and the clarity existed, and when the moment required them, I had them available. The preparation had been thorough. The outcome had reflected the preparation. By any reasonable accounting, the week after the conference room should have felt like arrival. It felt like a Wednesday. Not anticlimactic. Accurate. The restaurant was still there. The kitchen still needed to run. The staff still needed to be managed. The vendors still needed to be paid. The buyout negotiation was ongoing. Dana had a timeline but not an endpoint. I went to the restaurant 6 days that week and did what I always did, which was arrive early and leave late and keep the records. The week after the conference room was the week I understood something that I want to say carefully because I think it is important. Resolution is not the same as transformation. The conference room resolved the legal situation. It established, on paper, with signatures, what I was owed and what the partnership had been and what the record showed. That is significant. That is not small. But it did not transform anything about how I had spent 11 years, or what those years had cost, or the particular weariness of being the person who does the work while someone else takes the credit for a very long time. Transformation is slower than resolution. It happens in the months after, when you are building something new and you keep noticing the absence of the thing you were carrying for 11 years. The weight you do not have to carry anymore. The decisions you make alone because you are the only partner and the specific lightness of that, not loneliness, not the loneliness I was warned about, but the cleanness of authority that belongs entirely to you and does not have to be negotiated. Celestines has no partner because I found out what partnership costs when it is not structured correctly, and what it costs to exit one, and what the exit looks like when you have the documentation. I have not sworn off collaboration. I am working with the wine consultant, with Amara, with Claude. But collaboration is different from partnership, which is different from marriage, which is different from what I had with Marcus, a 50-50 agreement that was practiced as a diminishing return on my 50. I will not do that again. And the thing that protects me from doing it again is not a rule or a vow or even a lesson. It is the 11 notebooks in the box, which I keep because they are evidence of how long I let something go unremarked, and I look at that box sometimes and let it tell me what it tells me. I want to tell you about my mother, because she is in this story even though she never appears in it. My mother came from Nigeria at 24. She was a secondary school teacher in Lagos and she became a secondary school teacher in Cincinnati, which took 3 years of navigating a credentialing process that was specifically designed to be difficult and which she completed anyway because she was that kind of woman. She taught mathematics for 27 years. She retired at 61 and she has spent the 14 years since her retirement reading, gardening, and telling her children what she thinks with a specificity that is sometimes uncomfortable. When I told her about the management fee and the conference room, she listened the whole way through. Then she said, "How did you not see it sooner?" I said, "I saw it. I just didn't know what I was seeing at the time." She said, "You mean you saw it and you chose not to name it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I thought about the honest answer. I said, "Because naming it would have required me to confront the possibility that I had chosen the wrong partner, and I had given 11 years to the restaurant, and confronting that possibility felt like losing the 11 years. She said, "The 11 years were not the wrong decision. The wrong decision was not confronting it sooner." I said, "I know." She said, "You have the notebooks?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And the money?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then the 11 years produced the restaurant, the notebooks, and what you're owed. That is not nothing." My mother does not often say things that make me feel better, because she is not primarily interested in making me feel better. She is primarily interested in accuracy. But in this case, the accurate version was also the better version, and I held on to it. The 11 years were not the wrong decision. They produced what they produced. I kept the records. The records were retrievable. The money followed the records. What I do next is mine, and mine from the beginning. Dana called me 3 months after the conference room, not about the case. It was resolved. The papers were signed. Phil had processed the management fee restoration. She called about something else. She said, "I want to refer a client to you." I said, "What kind of client?" She said, "A chef. 14 years in a partnership situation. That sounds familiar." She's starting to see the pattern and she needs someone to talk to who has been on the other side of it. I said, "What do you mean, talk to?" She said, "Not legal advice. You're not an attorney. Just your experience." how you recognized it, what you did, what the notebook is. I said, you want me to tell her my story? She said, I think it would help. I talked to the chef. Her name was Marguerite. She had 14 years and no notebook yet, but a very clear sense of what was happening in her partnership and a specific frustration at not knowing what to do with the clarity. I said, start the notebook tonight. Not next week. Tonight. She said, what do I write? I said, what happened today? Who made what decision? Whether it was a decision that required both of you. If you're not sure, read the agreement and check. She said, and then what? I said, then you come back to it in a month and see what the month looks like in writing. You'll know what to do next. She did. She called me 6 weeks later. She said, I see it now. It's very clear now. I said, I know. She said, what do I do? I said, call Dana. She called Dana. The situation is ongoing. I do not know how it ends. I know that she has the notebook and the agreement and the clarity, and those are the tools, and the tools are what the outcome depends on. I told her, the records do not protect you from what is happening. They make the truth retrievable when you need to retrieve it. Keep going. She is keeping going. Here is the last thing I want to say. I have spent 34 years in professional kitchens. In that time I have cooked for tens of thousands of people who will never know my name, who will remember the dish and not who made it, which is the correct order of things in my profession. The cook is the vehicle. The food is the thing. You do not make food so that people will know you made it. You make food because you understand something about the combination of ingredients and technique and timing that produces, when everything works, the specific experience of a person tasting something and feeling, for a moment, exactly right. That is what I have given 34 years to. Not recognition, not credit, the work itself, and what the work produces in the person eating it. The partnership dispute was not about recognition either, at its core. It was about $214,000 that was not Marcus's to take, and about a business that was being conducted as though one partner had more authority than the agreement granted, and about a woman who had the documentation to say so when the time came. Those are practical things, important and practical and worth pursuing, and I pursued them, and I am glad I did. But what I am most glad of is the notebook. Not because of what it produced in the conference room, though I am glad of that too. Because the notebook is what kept me honest with myself for 11 years. Every entry I made was a reckoning with what was actually happening, as opposed to what I wished were happening or what I was telling myself so that I could keep going. The notebook did not let me hide from the truth of the partnership. It made the truth legible, day by day, entry by entry, until the truth was so legible that I could not look away from it, and when I stopped looking away the rest followed. Keep the notebook. Not for the conference room. For yourself. For the clarity that accumulates when you write down what is real and date it and do not throw it away. The clarity is the thing. Everything else follows from the clarity. I want to tell you about the dish. Not the winter squash dish. I have told you about that. I want to tell you about the first dish I ever made that I knew was mine. Not a version of someone else's recipe, not an adaptation, not an interpretation of a classical technique applied to a new ingredient. A dish that came entirely from my own thinking, with no template, that solved a problem I had been carrying in my head for months without knowing I was carrying it. I was 26. I had been on the line for 3 years. I was working for a chef named Teresa, who was the first woman who had ever run a kitchen I worked in, and who was the first person in my professional life who treated my opinion about food as information rather than noise. The dish was a preparation of bitter greens with a warm, acidic dressing that I had been working on in my head while doing prep, the specific mental activity of a cook who is doing something with her hands while her brain is solving a different problem. I had been thinking about the relationship between bitter and acid and how most preparations I had eaten tried to suppress the bitterness rather than balance it, and I thought the balance was possible, and I had been thinking through the ratios while cutting herbs for 2 weeks. I made it on a Sunday, on my day off, in my apartment, with second-hand equipment and grocery store greens that were not the quality I would have wanted but were available. I made it 6 times. The sixth version was right. I knew it was right the way you know things when you have been working on them long enough, not with excitement, but with the specific quiet of a solution arriving. I brought it to Teresa the following week. She tasted it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where did this come from?" I said, "It came from me." She said, "Put it on the Tuesday menu." It's sold out. She put it on the permanent menu. It stayed there for 2 years, which is a long time for a menu item, and every plate of it that went out of that kitchen was mine. My thinking, my ratio, my solution to the problem I had been carrying in my head. I have made hundreds of dishes since then. I have put my name on menus and signed off on prep lists and trained 60 people in the specific mechanics of translating my thinking into food. But I think about that dish sometimes, the one at 26, because it was the first time I understood what it meant to make something completely. Not just execute, make. From the idea through the iterations to the thing that is right. That is what I have been doing for 34 years. Making things completely. The kitchen was mine at Reeves and Okafor in exactly the same sense that the dish was mine at 26, not in the legal sense, which was 50-50, but in the sense of authorship. I made it. It came from my thinking. The notebook is the record of the making. All 11 years of it. Marcus underestimated me because he had not understood what making completely looks like from the outside. It looks like things working. It does not announce itself. The walk-in is maintained, the staff are trained, the food cost is under target, the service runs. These are not the things you notice. They are the things you notice when they stop working, and in my kitchen they did not stop working, which meant they were invisible. I made the kitchen invisible by making it excellent. That is the paradox of operational mastery. The better you are, the less visible you become. Celestine's will be visible from the beginning. My name on the door is the beginning of the visibility. The notebook I am keeping is the ongoing record of it. Every dish I make, every staff meeting I run, every vendor negotiation I have, every decision, it is all in the notebook, dated, mine. I am done being invisible. I want to tell you about the moment the buyout number was agreed to, because it was the moment I had been working toward without knowing I was working toward it since month 4 of year 1. Dana and Richard had been negotiating the valuation for 2 weeks. Phil had done the independent assessment. The number was a number I had not let myself calculate before it was real, because calculating it would have felt like anticipation, and anticipation, in my experience, is the thing that makes the fall harder when it comes. The number was real. Dana called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was doing prep. I had flour on my hands. I washed them before I answered, which is a habit. You do not hold a phone with flour on your hands. She said, "Richard's client has agreed to the valuation." I said, "What's the number?" She told me. I stood at my prep station in the kitchen I had built, and I looked at the flour on the cutting board, and I thought about month 4 of year 1, when I had opened the first notebook and written the first entry because something in the room felt like a future problem, and I wanted to have the record when the future arrived. The future had arrived. The record had held. I said, "Thank you, Dana." She said, "You did the work." I said, "I know. That's been the whole story." She said, "See you at signing." I hung up. I stood in the kitchen for another minute. Then I went back to the prep, because the service was in 4 hours and the stock needed attention, and the work does not stop for the moment. It never does. You carry the moment with you and you keep working. That is what I have always done. That is what the notebook documents, one entry at a time. Phil came to the opening dinner at Celestine's. He sat at the bar with his wife, a patient woman who has been listening to Phil talk about restaurant finances for 20 years and who understands food in the way that people who love someone who loves food eventually come to understand it, with affection and attention if not expertise. He ordered the winter squash dish. He ate it slowly, the way I want people to eat it. When he finished, he looked at me across the bar and nodded once. That was all. One nod. From the man who had found the management fee in 3 years of line items, who had sent me the email that changed the shape of everything, who had done the forensic work that gave Dana what she needed, and who had been doing my books with integrity for 11 years before any of this happened. I nodded back. The restaurant was full that night. Not because of my name, which was new on the door, because of the food, which was mine, and the staff I had trained, who were excellent, and the systems I had built before we opened, which were working the way systems work when they are built correctly. Darius was there too. The cook who had left in year 7, who is now in his own kitchen in another city. He had come back to Cincinnati for a week, and he had made a reservation, and he sat at a table by the window, and he ate the bitter greens preparation I have been making since I was 26, in this new version, adapted, solved again. He sent me a message after, still the best version of that dish I've ever had. I wrote it in the notebook. The same day as the opening dinner, the same entry. Not for evidence, because it was real, and real things deserve a record. The restaurant is real. The kitchen is mine. The name is on the door. That is what 34 years of making things completely looks like, finally, from the outside. Before I go, I want to come back to the question I asked you earlier. When did you last read the agreement? I want to add a second question, because I have been thinking about it since Marguerite called me and asked what to write in the notebook. The second question is, what are you making? Not in the legal sense. In the true sense. What is the thing you are building every day with your time and your labor and your expertise? What is the infrastructure that disappears into its own excellence? What is the kitchen that nobody sees because it is running too well to be noticed? Name it. Write it down. Date the entry. Not for the conference room, for yourself, so that the record exists of what you are making, in your own words, from the beginning. Because the record is what remains when someone says, I didn't think you were tracking all of this. You are always tracking it. You have always been tracking it. You just needed the notebook to make it visible, even if only to you, even if only on the page. Start tonight. Whatever you are making, name it. Write it down. Keep the record. The clarity is the thing. That is my story. 11 years, 11 notebooks, one accountant named Phil, one attorney named Dana, one management fee that was not Marcus's to take, one conference room where a man said I underestimated you, and a restaurant that opened in April with my name on the door. If this found you at the right moment, I want to hear from you. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me what you are building. Tell me what you have been tracking without knowing you were tracking it. I read every one. And if someone you know is in a partnership where the weight is not equal, where one person is in the kitchen and the other is in the dining room and the dining room is getting the credit, share this with them. Tell them to start the notebook. Tell them that the records are retrievable if they exist, and they only exist if someone builds them. Start the notebook. Keep the record. Know what you are making. Subscribe if you are new here. I will see you in the next one. And if you are ever in Cincinnati, come find Celestine's. Order the winter squash dish. I have been making a version of it since I was 26, and it is still getting better. That is what 3 decades of making something completely looks like. It keeps getting better. So do you. One last thing. The 11 notebooks are in a box in my office at Celestine's. Not at home, at the restaurant. I moved them there the week we opened. I want to be honest about why. It is not entirely practical. The practical reason is that the office at the restaurant is where the business records live, and the notebooks are business records, and they belong with the other business records. The real reason is that I wanted them in the building I built. Not the building Marcus and I built together, the building that is mine. I wanted the record of the 11 years that made Celestine's possible to be present in the place that their possibility produced. They are in a box on the shelf above the current notebook. The current notebook is open on my desk, current entry dated. Every morning when I arrive at 6 a.m., I write the date and I write what the day holds and what I am working on. Every evening before I leave, I close the notebook with the record of what happened. The kitchen is below. Amara is there by 6:30. Claude arrives at 3 for the dinner service. The vendors come and go throughout the morning. The prep lists are posted. The systems are running. The building is full of the work. The office holds the record of it. Both are real. Both are mine. That is the whole of it. That is everything.